Ah yes, Subnautica. This absolutely terrifying, hyper-realistic version of Minecraft, but in space. It truly is one of the greatest games ever released. But hey, what is Subnautica anyways? Well, Subnautica is an indie horror survival game, in which you play as a worker of the Alterra Corporation. You get sent to this random planet to investigate it and also colonize it, but uh-oh, bucko, your rocket ship thing, seriously, what is this thing? Got shot out of the sky, and you crash land on this planet that is completely underwater. Or as I call it, Earth in 10 years. After getting knocked out by a random wall panel, you wake up and holy shit, everything is on fire! In Subnautica, you start with nothing more but the new iPad and an AI companion that reminds me a little bit too much of GLaDOS from Portal. Seriously, it's quite unnerving. With no other options of where to go, you climb up the ladder out of your escape pod to see this incredible new world that you are stranded in. Or you could just go out the bottom hatch and then just skip the entire cutscene where it reveals this marvelous new world. But who would do that, am I right? The aim of Subnautica is pretty clear from the start. You go and explore and gather new materials. At the beginning of the game, it's so you can fix your escape pod and attempt to communicate with other pods, or, you know, get rescued. But as the game progresses, the goal is more about exploring more of this world and gathering new materials. And well, that's it really. Or is it? Could there be something more to this game? Something maybe even deeper? Well, I think it's time to deconstruct Subnautica to answer the question, is Subnautica truly a gaming masterpiece? Let's talk about it. But just before we get too far down the rabbit hole of Subnautica, I would just like to quickly ask that if you do enjoy this video, then make sure that you hit that subscribe button, as only 0.1% of you are subscribed. And if you want to see more content just like this, then maybe hit the bell as well? Damn, I didn't actually realize that rhymed. And hey, you can always change your mind later. Anyways, let's get back to the video. Every time that I deconstruct a game, I feel that it is seriously important to speak about its roots and how it grew into the current status that I slap onto it in the title. So let's do that. Subnautica is a small indie game that was developed by Unknown Worlds Entertainment. The game began development in late 2013 and became widely available to the public in the following year. And then another following year, the game blew up when Markiplier and Jacksepticeye, along with other YouTubers, began to cover it. It's important to note that the versions of the game that they were playing was the early access builds, so the game was only a fraction of what it would become in only 4 years later. But I don't want to be quick to dismiss and just generally glaze over the early access builds, because they had some genuinely interesting content that would eventually get scrapped. For instance, the terraforming tool, which allowed players to remove sections of the landscape so they could build some really cool bases. But unfortunately, this didn't make it through to the final game, as it got scrapped because it was causing way too many performance issues. Oh, yeah, that is something to mention. In the early access phase of the game, the performance just sucked. Like, it was really bad. The entire game was just a glitchy mess, but it got away with it a bit because of the premise of the game being so interesting to people. But there was one thing that Subnautica was really praised for in this time and upon release, and that was the world design. Subnautica has one of the best world designs I have ever seen in a game, and this is just due to the sheer scale of it. The world is absolutely massive. There is so much that you can go and do and explore, but when you first get into the game, you wouldn't necessarily think that the world is that big, and that's because Subnautica took a different approach to how their games would scale, and that was instead of building a game where you scale up and reach the top, you have to go all the way down. By the end of the game, you reach areas that are 1,400 meters deep, and it's safe to say that it's absolutely fucking terrifying. The developers did a very good job of making every area feel unique just with the resources and area design alone, but when you factor in the unique creatures in each area, that arguably gets more horrific the deeper you go down. And when everything's in combination, it really fits together to become a connected but also isolated experience. There isn't really anywhere you feel safe in Subnautica, well, besides the area you spawn in. Every part of the world has its own threats, and I think that's absolutely incredible. I remember the first time I played Subnautica and I had to make benzene to make a new piece of equipment, and so I went looking and eventually I found blood oil to make the benzene. But of course it was in a cave, so me being a dumbass decided to dive down further. And the further I kept going down, the more I was in absolute awe of how deep this game actually is. Every time that you think that you can't go deeper, you can. That is, of course, if you can manage the body shaking horror of it. Speaking of horror, Subnautica has a very unique approach to handling horror. Instead of the typical jump scare horror that many have come to associate with indie horror games, the developers of Subnautica had another plan. The Subnautica team decided to root their game in one of the most common fears that humans have, and that is the fear of the unknown. There isn't a single part of this game that isn't terrifying to new players, but what I find truly incredible is that even after God knows how many times I have replayed this, the descent into the core of the world is still terrifying to me. There isn't just a single reason for this either. The horror of the game comes from multiple things that are mixed together. The biggest fear is, of course, the sounds of the creatures that I was talking about earlier. Every single creature in this game has its own sounds, and it's safe to say that every single one of them makes me shit a brick every time I hear them. I have never not heard a Reaper teleport somewhere and not been shaken to my core, and then frantically scouring my surroundings hoping I can spot it before it spots me. Holy shit! I mean, Jesus Christ, this game is that terrifying that the mere thought of me going anywhere near the Aurora is enough to make me shiver. Just because the Reaper might be nearby, like just might be in the local vicinity, that is enough to terrify me. And that is when you know that you have mastered making horror games. But I don't feel that this game would be anywhere as nearly horrifying if it wasn't for the music. So let's talk about it. Subnautica has some of the most unique music I have ever heard in a game, and I know I'm saying this a lot, but it is just really true. And all of this is thanks to Simon Shalinsky. I really hope I pronounced that right. Every single track on the OST is so unique, but what they do have in common is the eerie techno sound to them. This sound does a very good job of making every single track feel out of place, which contributes to getting the player on edge. When you reach certain areas in the game and hear that deep thud in the music, it is absolutely horrifying. And it does a great job of making you feel vulnerable. And I just have to say that it is an absolutely thrilling feeling. There really isn't a way of putting my feelings on the music into words because it really just doesn't do it justice. Sound design is something that is incredibly important to me for making something scary or making me feel any type of emotion, and my god, Subnautica really doesn't disappoint. Every sound in this game is so deeply terrifying, but when it's mixed with the deep bassy sound from the music, it brings it to a new level. Now, unfortunately, we have reached this part in the video where I do need to advise that if you haven't played Subnautica yet, then you go and play it, because we are diving into the spoiler section. So with that in mind, I think it's time that we move on to the real reason that Subnautica is truly a gaming masterpiece. As I hinted at previously, Subnautica has a lot of hidden depth to it, and as you begin to go deeper down into the world, you will start to realize that nothing is as it seems. After playing the game for long enough, you will eventually come and be rescued by a ship called the Sunbeam, and after the countdown is finished and you've reached the rendezvous point to be rescued, the weird looking building that you stand next to on the island starts to aim something at the ship, and suddenly...
Change course. Set thrusters to full.
This was the point in the game where I realized there is something bigger going on here. And this is also the point in the game where the motivation of the player shifts from just surviving to actively trying to uncover what's really going on here. Now, the story of Subnautica is very expansive, but there's also more to it than just what you physically observe, and a lot of the finer details are hidden away in the PDA's databank. But I also really like that this game has a lot of events that the player can see and interact with. I feel like it's a perfect balance between giving the player enough detail so they aren't completely lost about what's going on, but also allowing people to gain a deeper understanding of the world if they want to know more. But after the Sunbeam event and exploring the alien base, there aren't a lot of details about the story until you quite literally dive deeper, and this is where my favorite thing about the game comes in. And that is Subnautica's seamless blend of survival and story. In order to go through the tech tree, you have to dive into the deeper parts of the game, and while you do that, you also run into these bases that explain the story. And then in the final area of the game, the inactive lava zone, the two paths of playing the game merge together as you find the primary containment facility. And this is where you learn that the precursors, or the aliens, were actually up to some horrific shit. And finally, all the pieces of the puzzle that were slowly being built over the course of the game just finally clicked together. The massive space weapon thing, the warpers, the bases, all of it made sense. It was all in an attempt by the precursors to save save themselves. And now I will save the ending for you to explore on your own, but the basics of it are you have to synthesize a cure to deactivate the gun and then use the schematics that you find in the Aurora to build a rocket to leave the planet. But this is also the section of the game that I dislike the most. The ending of Subnautica is very tedious. The way of actually getting the cure is just a massive fetch quest that you have to go to every single area in the game to get the required items, and then building the rocket is just long and boring as it requires a lot of materials that are just really annoying to get. And to be fair, it isn't really that bad, it's just tedious and a tiny bit annoying at times. I don't feel that it takes too much away from the experience of the game, as this is only something that you probably will have an issue with the most if you decide to replay it a couple of times, but on a first playthrough it really isn't that bad. But of course, no game is without its issues, so let's take a minute to speak about them. Now, Subnautica is not without its issues, the primary one of course being the performance. The game in the early areas runs very well, but the further through the game you get, the more noticeable the performance becomes. It's pretty hard to say what exactly causes these issues, but my personal opinion is that probably just the amount of stuff that's rendered in at one time. There's a lot of fine details in Subnautica's areas, and I think that they take a decent hit on the game, but without having the actual project file, it's pretty hard to diagnose exactly what the issue is here. So to be completely honest, my best guess is probably pathfinding and rendering. However, I do have to say that the game runs significantly better in this state than it does in the early access builds, which of course it has to, because if it doesn't, then that raises significant questions about the games and it would be a major problem. But something that is a big issue is the tediousness of the game. A lot of the sections in this game can be very long and annoying, and this typically falls between the best sections of the game, and that's exploring further down. Getting the resources and fragments for blueprints in this game can be incredibly annoying because it feels like a massive fetch quest. This isn't really applicable for the entire game, but it's most prevalent in the later half of it. Now, the next issue I have with the game is actually just about the quality of life features. For instance, the hotbar is really quite small and the storage in the inventory isn't fantastic, but that does get addressed the further you get in the game. For instance, the Cyclops having storage lockers and you can build more, and then just the storage module for the Seamoth, and of course the prawn suit's own storage. I just wish that there was more inventory space for the early game because it can be quite annoying to have to go back to the life pod to then drop the stuff off and then just have to go right back. It isn't like this is a game-breaking issue, it's just a bit of an inconvenience to be honest. But there is a certain group of people that want to address these issues, so let's speak about them. Now, the modding community in Subnautica is absolutely massive. The sheer amount of new content and quality of life improvement mods that are out there is absolutely insane. And even now, it's been a long time since the game released and people are still making more mods for it. And these mods are incredibly interesting and can bring an entirely new way to experience Subnautica. For instance, the Nitrox mod, which allows you to host servers and play Subnautica with your friends. And I find that really amazing because it can bring so much fun for new players and returning players alike. And what I love about Subnautica is that it isn't really all that hard to make mods for, but also to install mods for. These really incredible mods really don't take that much to install, and they're really easy to get set up. And it doesn't require a long process like a lot of games. Yes, I am looking at you, GTA 5. But there is actually another group of people who actively are making Subnautica a more enjoyable experience for players, and that is of course the developers. Unknown Worlds are some of the best developers I have ever seen. The whole reason that Subnautica is what it is today is because of their love for the project. The developers are absolutely devoted to making this game an enjoyable experience, and I think that that becomes very apparent when you look at the fact that the game is still regularly being updated. Throughout the entire development of Subnautica Below Zero, the team were going back and adding new content and quality of life improvements into Subnautica, and that is something that is rarely ever seen. The developers aren't shy about showing their appreciation they have for the community and for the game itself. This was really showcased when they gave YouTubers early access to the final release, and the developers left them a message explaining that the support that they showed for the game just by playing it had saved their company from going under. This is what makes Unknown Worlds better than any studio. They have a great sense of gratitude for their players, and they actively want to make a game for them all to enjoy. And that is one of the reasons why Subnautica is so incredible, because in an industry where monetization is the primary concern of a big AAA company, there are still game studios that don't care about making profit, they just care about making a game out of love. And Unknown Worlds are the best example of this. And so that is why Subnautica is a gaming masterpiece. Thank you for watching.